I'm not sure, has any one of you heard of Startup Genome before? Yeah? Have you read any of our publications, for example, or? Amazing, cool. So all of the others never heard about Startup Genome. That's great, because then there's a reason for me to be here and to talk a little bit about what we're doing and how it may be useful to you. My name's Marc. I'm one of the founders. I spent the last 6-7 years in San Francisco. Before that in Germany, one of the founders of Startup Genome. In my spare time, I work with the World Economic Forum, for example. I advise the Helmholtz Research Association and lots of startups, extremely passionate about startups, corporate startup relationships, etc. So very, very eager to have conversations with you on all of these topics later today. The reason why we started Startup Genome is actually this graph. And what you see on the axis is the exit value of Silicon Valley, the cumulative exit value of Silicon Valley versus the exit value in New York, in London, Beijing, Boston, Tel Aviv, and the rest of the world. It's pretty incredible, right? Incredible to see how relevant Silicon Valley is, or how relevant it was in 2011, 2012. And how irrelevant many of the regions, many of the places are that we are located in. So this was one of the reasons why we said, okay, let's do something about this. And what we tried to do was to bring together a network of innovation agencies, ministries, and really public policy leaders all around the world to share learnings, to first of all understand what the global startup ecosystem is, and to work together to understand how can public policy support the development of our regions, of our startup ecosystems. Here in Germany, we work with the state government of Hesse, for example. We work with the state government of North Rhine-Westphalia. But it's really a global play at this point, with about 50 countries represented, working very closely with South Korea, Japan, and many other countries and ecosystems around the world. Today, for that matter, we're considered the leading innovation policy research firm and advisory body. Our team, and especially our executive team, is made up of entrepreneurs like myself, but then also former leaders of innovation agencies, data scientists, researchers, and many other people in other occupations. Basically, the reason I asked, have you ever heard about Startup Genome, was because our Global Startup Ecosystem report, for the most part, has become quite an influential report when corporate leaders, startup executives, anyone interested in the startup ecosystem tries to get an understanding of what is happening globally, the big picture. So what we've done with around 300 organizations in the world is to build the world's largest database on startups and startup ecosystems, trying to bring together not only the big venture capital databases like Dealroom, Crunchbase, PitchBook, all of which are great partners of ours, but then really also work with over 50,000 startup executives year over year, as well as many, many other organizations around the world, if you recall this map earlier, in order to understand what activity is actually taking place in each of these places. Because you will know the data on the global startup ecosystem is incredibly scarce, right? There are so many Series A rounds, Series Seed rounds, and earlier rounds that we tend to miss when we tap into global databases. And this is one of the problems that we were actually trying to tackle and trying to solve. We also continue to bring together leaders similar to this format. The last event, in partnership with the Financial Times, we brought together prime ministers, we brought together corporate executives like Werner Vogels from Amazon, and many of our clients that you've seen earlier, in order to really have a conversation around what is happening in tech globally. And I hope that I can give you a few pointers on, some of the latest findings that we've seen in our assessments. So just very briefly, 3 core topics for today. One is a few key insights on the state of the global startup economy. Then I also wanted to understand a little bit the subsectors in tech, right? It's not just about startups and startup ecosystems as a whole, but what's happening in artificial intelligence specifically, what is happening in advanced manufacturing specifically. So we're going to look just a little bit on some of these points. And then last but not least, because we've had a few first partnerships with corporate leaders the last couple of months, I would love to understand, how can some of this data be useful to you? So we're going to look at that a little bit. As far as the state of the global startup economy is concerned, this is really, really fortunate timing, because in 4 weeks' time, we'll be launching our Global Startup Ecosystem Report 22 at London Tech Week with the mayor. And I'm going to share with you some initial findings from this report. And the findings are under embargo. So I hope you appreciate that, not all of this can go on Twitter, etc. It might not be what you're interested in doing anyway, but I'm just saying, like, it'd be lovely for some of these findings to stay here in the room for now. What we find, first of all, if you go back to the chart that I showed you earlier, we're trying to understand what is the global startup ecosystem if we combine all of the valuations, all of the funding rounds. And it's always the first impressive number that I like to take a look at, because we're at this point at $6.4 trillion in value, which, as many of you know, is actually higher than the GDP of all G7 economies but the United States. Right? So just a couple of years ago, I remember startups and startup ecosystems being this little cute thing that the big four, for example, didn't bother to look at, etc. And now we're really talking about massive, massive value creation at a global level. The tech ecosystem represents over 4% of the global economy, and it's growing at 10% a year, which is 3 to 4x the rate of our economies. And we predict if that growth continues to take shape the way it is right now, within the next 20 years, it will become the largest single sector of the world's economy. One reminder of that growth was the pandemic, I believe, right? And this chart shows a little bit what we're talking about here. When you compare the performance of S&P 500 companies that are not IT, information technology, versus those that are actually IT, you're seeing that especially during the pandemic, we've seen this incredible growth on the IT side, and we're seeing kind of normal growth, normal trajectory on the non-IT side. When we look under the hood, I remember, going to Silicon Valley and looking at this initial chart and thinking really, okay, this is the mecca, this is where it's happening. When we look under the hood now of how the ecosystem globally is actually taking shape, we're seeing that Silicon Valley is actually getting less and less and less important, which is great news for all of us. But at the same time, it also, as corporate leaders, it tells me, gets a bit more challenging to really understand who is at the forefront of the technology and the innovation that I care about for my company, right? It's not only that you go to Silicon Valley 4 times a year and then you basically get the full download of what is happening in the world. But innovation sits in many different pockets in the world these days, and it's about getting smarter and understanding where to find that innovation. I just wanted to bring back this chart to tell you, how did it look like 10 years ago. But then when you look at what has been happening since, from 2012 to 2021, in terms of early stage funding, and this is a concept that I think we're claiming at Startup Genome. Early stage funding is basically just Series Seed and Series A combined into early stage funding, which in many ways is a great predictor of how relevant a region is going to be in technology, right? Because if you have a lot of really, really good seed rounds, high valuation, a lot of Series A rounds, high valuations in Series A, then you're probably, just like statistics, you probably have a select few companies that are going to become really big and probably adding a lot of value to your economy. And we're seeing globally that in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, the global share of early stage funding continues to drop. And that's not only true for the value, but it's also true for the number of early stage funding rounds, right? Early stage funding is the leading indicator of ecosystem success, I would say. But when we look at share of exits larger than $1 billion in value, we're also seeing that this value actually halved between 2012 and 2021. So what we're seeing more and more is Silicon Valley is becoming less and less important. And where is that growth actually happening right now? At this point, we're seeing globally that only 63% of the value that is created in the global startup ecosystem sits in the top 10 locations around the world. In 2011, we were at 87%. Right now, this is one of the most fascinating statistics I found in the global report this year. We're seeing over 110 regions, cities for the most part in the world that have already managed to create at least one unicorn. Right? So going back to my point that technology is more and more democratized around the world, 110 ecosystems produce at least one unicorn. The other number I think is incredible as well. I mean, when you look at 2013, we were, just shy of 5 ecosystems that actually had created a unicorn at the time. So really in the last 10 years, we've seen an incredibly dynamic global startup ecosystem taking shape. And I think last year alone, expectations were just completely blown out of the park, with over 550 companies alone globally reaching unicorn status. And I suppose we can have longer conversations about inflated valuations and too much money in the market, etc. But, looking at these numbers, it's quite incredible. When we look at the different regions, because in the end, what I wanted to do here, knowing that many of you are from the German ecosystem, I wanted to try to get from the global to the local and try to understand, okay, Silicon Valley is getting less and less important. There's value created in many other regions around the world. So here, as a first step, I wanted to show you what is happening when we look at regions. And here, we're specifically looking at the share of top ecosystems in our top 100 ranking, right? And we're seeing pretty boring North America continues to dominate. We're seeing pretty boring South America, doesn't really do the job very well at this point in time. But then what I find interesting to show you here is that in Europe, we're not necessarily catching up as much as I think we would want to, right? And on the flip side, Asia Pacific, we're seeing that they continue to grow faster than us. We see that they continue to create more unicorns than us, much more investment into the tech ecosystem, which when we look at the macroeconomics of the global startup ecosystem, I think in terms of our economy, we're losing our competitive edge slowly. One of the more important regions or countries that are really taking place or performing very well in the global startup ecosystem has notoriously been China, right? The last 10 years, there were so many articles talking about the rise of China. China's overtaking the US. We have no way of competing with China in terms of the global startup ecosystem. But this year, for the first time, or 2021, for the first time, we actually saw a flip in the development where China is not growing as fast and as impressive as it used to be in the past, right? What we're seeing in this year's report is the rise of India, right? India rose in the ranking as far as almost 5 cities are concerned. They increased their ranking in the top 100. They created unicorns on a weekly basis. And it's really happening in India. It's not only China and the United States that we're competing against as a European startup community, but it's really about what is happening in China and India these days as well. So here you can see the comparison, India in red, China in blue, indexed to 2012, how fast VC funding has been growing in India and how fast the number of exits has been growing in India in comparison to China. And we're seeing, especially the last couple of years, especially last year, a total flip. Where does Germany come into the picture? We're seeing basically that we're not catching up, right? When we look at Berlin, Berlin is a great ecosystem, a lot of great companies, but still in global comparison, we're at the end of the top 20 ranking continuously. Munich doesn't necessarily perform better. Hamburg continued to drop as well. What we're seeing is that Frankfurt and it's great that we're in Hesse here today. Frankfurt, over the course of the last couple of years, actually managed to grow in the ranking, to have more and more impressive companies, specifically in fintech, artificial intelligence, etc. But then, of course, starting from rank 86 is perhaps a bit easier in regional or in national comparison to continue to grow in the ranking and the performance. When we look at subsectors as opposed to regions and cities, by subsectors we basically mean what is happening in the startup ecosystem of artificial intelligence, big data, advanced manufacturing, clean tech. What we're seeing is that there are clear subsectors that are growing extremely fast. And here we're looking at the exit growth on a 5-year timeline, and we're looking at the growth of Series A rounds globally on a 5-year timeline. We're seeing that there are a few subsectors that were quite important the last couple of years. EdTech, for example, up until big tech took over, and EdTech is no longer a space for young, emerging, high-growth firms, right? We're seeing that there are maturing subsectors, as we call them, with a pretty steady growth of exits and Series A rounds. These are clean tech, EdTech, gaming. But then I think it's quite stunning, and we'll see that in Europe as well, that there are some clear leaders in the global subsector space, advanced manufacturing, AI, big data, and analytics at the forefront, still continuing to grow much, much faster than any of the other subsectors in the world. When we zoom into how it looks like in Europe, we're seeing that it's more homogeneous, as we call it, because we're perhaps growing not as fast, but we're growing in a very similar way as far as exits and Series A rounds are concerned. But then what I found quite interesting is that when we look at exits and exit growth, there is a lot happening in Europe these days, right? So there is a clear trend and opportunity for us to take a look at what is happening in the AI ecosystem. Again, I wanted to bring Germany's relative comparison. So this is the global ranking of Berlin, Bavaria, Hamburg, and Hesse when you look at these specific clusters or specific subsectors of innovation. And what you're seeing is, pretty much in line with what we've seen in the general ranking. But here, when we look at AI, I think it's even clearer that we're not really ahead of the game. But we're continuing to lose our edge, and it's been talked about in media a lot. But here's another snapshot why that's true. And this is our performance of Hesse, for example, Hamburg, and the other states in comparison to what is happening in the world in AI. And very timely, but I just wanted to mention that together with the minister, Tarek Al-Wazir, here in Hesse, we just released a report that I invite you to read, to digest, on how to grow the commercialization of artificial intelligence here in the state, how to work closer with the universities and how to help them really drive faster into commercialization efforts, which essentially, in our opinion, solves one of the bigger problems that we have here in Germany, and that we perhaps specifically have here in Hesse when we talk about really maximizing the potential of our artificial intelligence capabilities and bringing them into the private market. Last but not least, and this is actually why I wanted to be here and start having a conversation with you, because the last couple of months, more and more corporations actually reached out to us, some of which have understood that it's not as easy anymore to source the greatest innovation by just visiting a select few ecosystems in the world on an ongoing basis. And one case study that I wanted to bring is I've been in close communication with the managing director of Intel Ignite and the board of Intel Corporation in order for them to understand where in the world should we actually open our next startup. It out in Tel Aviv. They then moved to Munich, as perhaps some of you know. They have an outfit in Austin, Texas. But now they didn't really have a clue. Okay, so what are the next chapters? Where should we actually prioritize and allocate our resources? So basically what we've done is we looked at our global database and try to understand, first of all, okay, what are the highest performing ecosystems in the world? You've seen the ranking, this is quite clear. But then when we look at what Intel is interested in, specifically semiconductors, quantum computing, etc., does the global innovation ecosystem look a bit different there? And if yes, how does it change the way Intel is thinking about it and setting up shop in a location, right? So then we looked at, what is happening specifically in quantum computing, semiconductors, etc. And then we also looked at another area that I found quite interesting, which is kind of going back to Peter Thiel's concept of blue ocean, red ocean. We're looking at accessibility scores, which means basically how many investable startups do you have in an ecosystem per acceleration program, right? And when you look at, for example, New York, you may have a lot of great startups, but you also have, hundreds of accelerator programs. So we were trying to understand, okay, where can Intel actually come in and have a competitive edge, not only looking at the subsectors, but also looking at the competitive edge that they can have in terms of, being the first or the second in a market, in an ecosystem. And then as the fourth step, and this is what you can see here, once a decision was made on which ecosystem is actually the best opportunity for Intel, we were mapping where in the city do we see actually the highest concentration of relevant activity, new startups being founded, investments being made, exits being facilitated or negotiated, and basically supporting them on understanding, where do we actually want to be in order to have the maximum amount of conversations and really the highest frequency of interactions with the local startup ecosystem. And this is one of the topics that I really wanted to discuss with you today. Like, what do you actually do? How do you source innovation? How do you approach it from a data point of view? And I'm sure I can learn a lot from you. And I hope that if you read the report that we're launching in 4 weeks' time, you might be able to learn a little more from us as well in our team. There's not only this global report that we publish once a year, but we also go deeper into some of the specific verticals that I mentioned earlier. It might be a bit hard to read, but we just published a specific report on ag tech and new food. We're publishing on cybersecurity, AI, EdTech, Industry 4.0, and some of these other verticals that in our mind are essential and very important in the course of the next couple of months. And really invite you to download these publications. They're for free. And reach out to me if you are interested in any of the findings or the data underneath that. Perfect. And that's it. Hope it was useful. Thank you so much. And really looking forward to the day here.
Yeah, thank you very much. You still have 6 minutes if you want to tell something or another best practice that you want to share. We say that's also a nice example.
So I'm not sure what is interesting here because I just joined the conversation and I'm walking into the room and I understand that you already had a number of really interesting conversations yesterday, and perhaps I can replay that question to you and see, is there any, if we look at a Venn diagram, is there any overlap in what we're doing at Startup Genome, our data, our work, and some of the questions that you're trying to get an answer to in your day-to-day? And there may or may not be questions, comments, but I think that would be the best way to approach it.
I think in the morning, everybody's a little bit shy. We have a question.
Do you have a connection to corporate activities? You have shown in your data, do you have any connection to corporate activities? You have shown the ecosystems, the venture capital activities, the exit activities, and so on.
Yeah.
But for corporates, very often the question where to start and where to, let's say, begin a new activity in terms of innovation. Yeah. Also is around the current presence that you have globally, right, as global companies. So is that something where you also measure this kind of interaction between corporates and startups locally?
Yeah, I mean, we can only talk about some of these things at a very high level in a 20-30 minute conversation, but when we advise governments, for example, they're also extremely interested in understanding the dynamics of the traditional innovation ecosystem, as we call it, right? Corporations, universities, and their interactions with the startup ecosystem. And we're looking at corporate activity, and we're also looking at patent activity, which I find an interesting concept, right? We have a partnership with one of the 2 leaders in patent development and patent assessment, a professor from UCLA. And together with him, we tried to understand, first of all, the global patent databases, like what kind of patents are emerging where, but then also trying to map each of these patents to the subsectors of innovation that I just showed you, right? Or at least some of them, in order to understand to what extent is the knowledge creation in any given ecosystem or in any given environment relevant to the potential output of a startup ecosystem, right? And then we're seeing in Frankfurt, for example, a number of specific patents in artificial intelligence. And then we're trying to understand, okay, how related are these patents with each other? How complex are they? How much are cited on an ongoing basis, et cetera. So in order for us to be able to really understand what kind of activities seem to emerge, if you think of traditional cluster theory in a region. But then since that data, we're also able to go down to the company level or to the innovator level, we can also try to understand, who are the network nodes in patent creation and knowledge creation that we want to combine actually because they're working on similar subjects and similar topics. So yeah, I didn't talk much about this, but there are some really, really fascinating insights and results from that work as well.